Bruchim Habayim. We are continuing on Shulchan Aruch, Chelek Gimel of Mishna Berura, Hilchot Shabbat, and we are starting the very relevant Siman Rishon Gimel, the halachot of Shehiyah, Chazara, Vatmana, all of the things that we need to know in a kitchen, like cooking, leaving things on stovetop, returning things on stovetop. Do you do it on open fire? Do you need a blech? How about the hot surfaces of the hot plates and crock pots and all those items we're going to be discussing in this Seif. Generally speaking, we're going to have two different topics. One is the topic of Shehiyah. Going into Shabbat, what can you leave on the stovetop, on the source of heat from before Shabbat going into Shabbat? And the second topic is going to be Chazara, that if I need to pick something up, a pot from the source of heat, can I return it? Can I return it? It looks like I'm putting a pot on fire on Shabbat. Doesn't look good. So aside from the issues of bishul, of dealing with causing something to be cooked further on Shabbat, we have to also deal with the issues of the optics of how it looks, of marit ayin. And with that, we're going to also discuss whether or not you could stir a pot, if it's cooked, if it's half cooked, if it's fully cooked. How about putting the lid back? If you, Friday night, you check on your cholent and now you want to put the lid back, can you do that, or maybe can you not? All of those items are going to be discussed over here. Now, in the time of Chazal, they had three different types of stoves. Well, their stove and oven was really the same thing, so let's call it ovens. They had something that's called tanur. They had something that was called a kira, and they had something else called a kupach. Generally speaking, we will deal with the first two. Tanur was more intensive heat. It was structured wide on the bottom, narrowing up to the top, and placed for one pot on the top. So this was an intense heat, all directed towards one pot, from a wider area to narrower areas. So that's the hottest oven that they had. The other normal thing that they used was a kira, which was a rectangular cube with two holes on the top for two pots, and it was even. The walls are straight, horizontal. They're not on a slope, and therefore the heat was less intense and still a normal way of cooking. Now, you would have a hole on the bottom that the fuel would be put in, the coals would be put in, and the heat, of course, is gathered and directed to the pots, right? So the source of heat was coals or any other source that you used for a fire. And it's important because we're going to be dealing with the source of heat and the comparison of that with the gas, for instance, or electric stovetops that we deal with nowadays. And then we have three different scenarios also that we're going to discuss. One is if the food is half cooked from before Shabbat. We call it ma'achal ben derusai. If it's 50% or 30% cooked, one half or 1/3 of its cooking, and whether or not you could leave it on the stove from before Shabbat going into Shabbat. Of course, you cannot put it on fire on Shabbat because that's cooking. You're finishing the cook. That of course you cannot do, but you could perhaps leave it on the stovetop from before Shabbat. Now we have to deal with whether or not it could be put on open fire, or do you need to maybe cover the fire source of heat? So that's one. Second is a tafshil, a food that has been fully cooked, and further cook is not even good for it. Mistamek veralo, right? So this is done. This food, you just want it to be warm and kept hot, but you don't want it to further cook. It's not even good for it. So what's going to be the halacha for that type? Can you leave it on a stove top without covering the source of heat, without covering the coals or taking the coals out? And the third is, if you have a raw food that you're putting on the stove right before Shabbat, or a food that's half cooked, but you dumped a piece of meat, a raw meat, right before Shabbat. So now you have some raw food inside there, and it's a raw food that takes time for cooking. It's not just some easy, like a piece of fish or something very easy to cook that in 2 minutes is going to be cooked, but it's a nice piece of steak, a nice piece of meat that takes time to cook. So that also would make a difference in the halacha of leaving something on the stove. So that we're going to discuss in this Seif. So let's, without further ado, start. Maran writes, Kirashi asuya kekedera. So his kira already is the second thing that we spoke. It's like a rectangular cube and two holes for two pots on top. Asuya kekedera. Veshoftin al pia kedera lemala. You put a pot on top of it. Veyesh ba makom shvitat shtei kederot. And you have place for putting two pots on top, as we explained. Im huska begefet shi psolet shel zetim. If you have serious fuel, right? For instance, you have actual coals, or you have psolet zetim, gefet, which would mean when they pressed olive for olive oil, the leftover of the actual fibers of zetim, which it still contains some oil, that would be pressed to coal-like items and would be used as fuel, right? And that gives serious heat and stays for hours and hours. It's not like straws that you set them on fire and in 5 seconds you're done, right? There will be a big fire for 5 seconds and then everything is completely turned to ashes. It would be like a coal. It would be burning for a long period of time. Or wood, which is again regular coals. Asur liten alea tafshil mi'ba'ot yom. You cannot put food on this kira, on this stove, even though that you're not doing anything on Shabbat. You want to leave the food from before Shabbat going into Shabbat. Now, the whole previous Siman, we spent time saying that you start a job from before Shabbat is mutar. So here, unless you have a concern of a chashash that you're going to come to Chilul Shabbat, here is no different. You're doing something from before Shabbat, so on Shabbat you're not planning to do anything. You want to leave it on the stovetop from before Shabbat, going into Shabbat, and yet it will be asur. If you have serious coals, we are concerned that you're going to stoke the coals. Unless, of course, there's no concern. Now, either there's no concern because your fuel is not a type that you could stare, you can't stoke, or the food is so cooked that you don't want to tamper with the fire at all, because any tamper with the fire is going to burn your food or decrease the quality of it, and therefore we know for sure you're not going to touch that fire. Now, also, you have to bear in mind that in the time of Chazal, tampering with the fire was something that they did constantly, right? To maintain a proper oven fire, you have to stoke it to, push away the ashes that are covering your source of fire, because when the coals burn, the surface turns to ashes. The ashes now are blocking between the fuel, the further fuel, and the oxygen that's needed for the fire. Like every fire needs fuel and oxygen. So when the oxygen is blocked, it doesn't burn well. So when you stoke it, you're pushing away the ashes, and now you're exposing the fire to oxygen, and it picks up the flame. So that's something that they did, and we're concerned you're going to come to do it unless you are very worried to burn your food, not to burn your food, and then you're not going to touch it. So therefore, says the Shulchan Aruch, Ela im ken nitpashel kol sorko. The exception would be the food that is completely cooked, vehu mistamek veralo, and further cook is not even good for it. It's not like cholent, that further cook is good for it. Like, Friday night you could have the cholent, but Shabbat morning is like something else. It's me'er olam haba, right? The cholent becomes amazing, and further cook makes it much better, right? But if you have a food, as I could say, you're brewing tea or coffee. So once it's brewed, you want to right away take it off. Further cook is very bad for it. It makes it bitter. It makes it too thick. The color changes. The whole thing gets messed up, right? So that's something that's mistamek veralo. Other foods also that further cooking dries them up and takes the juice out, and it will be not good. So says the Shulchan Aruch, in those cases, in those scenarios, you are allowed to do it when it's mistamek veralo. Why? Because the leka lemech Hashem ayechate. There's no concern that you're going to stoke the fire. The kevan shu chai. Or that immediately before Shabbat you're putting a pot that is completely raw. You have the cholent ingredients, all the meat and all the barleys and all the beans and everything, and it's completely raw. You put it on open fire, going into Shabbat, then you're good to go. Because this is going to take such a long time, you're not going to have it ready anyways for Friday night meal. So you give up your mind on having this on Friday night. And by Shabbat morning, it's so many hours that by Shabbat morning is anyways going to be ready. So you don't need to stoke it. So that's the second scenario. Either it's fully cooked and further cooking is bad for it, or it's completely raw, and therefore you're going to give up on it for tonight. You're not going to be nervous that, my guests are coming tonight. Let me stoke the fire to make sure it gets ready on time. It's not going to get ready for tonight, so you know it. So you completely block that out of your mind, and by tomorrow morning it's for sure going to be cooked. So therefore, there's no chashash, there's no concern that you're going to come to stoke it tonight. For that matter, it's also sufficient to just drop a piece of raw meat inside, even if the food is half cooked. But now, right before Shabbat, you drop a piece of raw meat inside, that the whole pot becomes like uncooked, and you're good to go. But, says the Shulchan Aruch, that's the two ends of the spectrum. But the middle case, that you have some food that is cooked somewhat, is edible, hardly, but it's not fully cooked, that's when it's going to be asur. We're not going to allow you to leave that on open fire from before Shabbat. Avalim nitbashel ktsat, if it's a little cooked. V'lo nitbashel kol sorko, but it's not fully cooked. V'afilu nitbashel kol sorko, and even if it is fully cooked, but it is mistamek v'yafelo, the further cook makes it better. Chayshin Hashem ayechateh. Then we're concerned you're going to stoke the fire. Ve'asur lashoto aleh. It's going to be asur to leave it on open fire unless you cover the source of fire. You cover it either by covering it. Right now, we have a blech on top of the stove. Right, you put the metal sheet. Back in the time of Chazal, they would take some ashes, cold ashes, or some sand, and they would spread on top of the hot coals. That's how they would cover the whole surface. Or you could conveniently just broom out and completely get rid of all the coals, right? That's another way. So we call it garuf. You took the coals out completely, or katum, or you covered them, right? Either take them all out, or katam, or you cover the gechalim. You take them out, and here is $1 million language. You cover them to decrease the heat. It's machloket rishonim. What exactly is the point of covering the coals? Is it to serve as a heker, as a reminder that as you come to stoke, you're like, oh, it's all covered, it doesn't look normal, and you remind yourself that this is Shabbat and you can't stoke the fire. Is that the reason? Or you also need something that decreases the level of the heat. Thereby you show that I don't care about the level of the heat. And when you decrease it biyadayim, you manually decrease the level of heat, for sure you're not going to come to try to increase it afterwards with stoking the fire, because you showed already that you don't care. So if you need both of these, that makes all the difference. I give you examples. For instance, having a thin foil, right, as your blech. Does that work? Well, if you have an actual blech, so the blech actually decreases the heat. Because if you have a pot on, try to put a pot of water on fire, on open fire, on your stovetop, right? On level 5, 6, whatever it is that you want to put, on high, medium, and see how much it takes for it to boil. And now, put the same pot with the same amount of water on the same type of flame with a blech. It'll take twice as much to boil. Why? Because it spreads the heat evenly, or somewhat evenly, and it decreases the level of intensity of the fire. So that's good. But if you have like a hot plate, or for that matter, a crock pot, let's imagine for a moment that we need to have a blech, to have a cover for the blech or the crock pot. So can I just line it with one layer of thin foil? Does that decrease anything? No, it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. Because a hot plate, it's already a metal sheet on top of it. Now you have another thin 0.1 millimeter of a thing over there. It doesn't make any difference, right? And same is with a crock pot. So therefore, you have those who, for instance, have aluminum balls inside the inner layer of the crock pot, hence pushing up the actual pot that contains the food a half inch. You see it sticking out of the crock pot, right? That lets the heat escape, and that basically lowers the level of heat. Hence, it will be that together with the sheet that they put there to line it. That would be the ma'et humam, comes from this Shulchan Aruch over here. So you see, it's very important, the mashmauti, words of the Shulchan Aruch. And if you put even one piece of raw meat in it, then it becomes mutar, as though the entire thing was raw. Because you're showing that I don't care about this for tonight, I want it for tomorrow morning. You have taken your mind off of it, and once you take your mind off of a pot for Friday night, you're not going to stoke the fire. Fine. And that, in that case, even if without kirufa v'ktuba, without the fire being covered, still would be mutar, as we mentioned before. Now, that is one halacha. Second halacha says the Shulchan Aruch, va'afilu enah kirufa uktuma, even if you don't have a fire that's covered, mutar lismoch la kederai, you could put a pot next to it, not on it, but next to it, besamuch chutzala, you're putting it outside the oven, outside the tanur, but the level of heat still is enough that warms up something that you put next to it, but that is not in a way that's going to be intense, and you're not concerned you're going to come to stoke the fire to warm up something that's outside. What difference doesn't make that much of a difference anyways, and we're not concerned about that. A third item here is ve'im huska bekash o begvava. All of this that we said until now is if you have solid, good coals, either from wood or from the psolet zetim, the olive things that we mentioned. But if you have like kash or kvava, you just have like some shells of produce or some straws. They're like nothing. You set them on fire right away, they're gone. If you are lighting them from small thin pieces of leaves and straws, mutar lashhot aleha, then you don't need to cover the fire because there is nothing to stoke. Nobody ever in their right mind stokes a fire that has been ignited by the fuel being, some leaves and straws. There's nothing to stoke. The stoking doesn't help. If anything, it ruins the fire more. So therefore, afilu ena lo grufa v'lo ktuma, even in that case, it will be mutar. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein, just want to give you the example of how this makes a difference. He entertains, he rejects it afterwards, of course, and so does everybody else. But he entertains the possibility in the beginning of one of his tshuas that, wait a second, so gas that we have nowadays, is that kashu gvava or is that considered gefet ve'etzim? What type of fuel is that? You don't stoke gas, last time I checked. And it doesn't do anything with you can't stoke it. So our source of fuel, we don't use coals in a regular Jewish kitchen or modern kitchen. We use gas or electricity, both of which don't need stoking. So maybe we shouldn't even need a blech nowadays, says Rav Moshe Feinstein. Or maybe we do. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says, well, still, first of all, the Gezerah of Chazal is the Gezerah of Chazal. Secondly, says now there's also people constantly, like a Jewish Baal Basta, if you put a body cam on her, you'll see, it's like, we have, the men have like an empty fridge syndrome. Like, you check the fridge 150 times an hour, right? And so the women have a similar thing. They go when somebody cooking constantly are turning it up, turning it down, adjusting it. Sometimes you don't even notice it yourself because part of what you do. Part of what you do, you put it on low because you got to be running there to change the diaper of the baby, and you want to make sure you don't forget to burn it. So you put it on low, and then you come back, put it back on medium again, and then all of a sudden your husband texts you that he's coming home. You put it on high to make sure to burn it before he comes, right? So that's what we do. So Rabbi Shlomo says at the end of the day, it doesn't make a difference. We need to cover our stovetops. Now this opens, of course, a very interesting topic of, is it enough to just cover the knobs? Or do you have to cover the fire? Because in the time of Chazal, there was no knobs, right? You only could cover the source of heat. But nowadays, the only thing that you could, meaning what you covered was what could be stoked. Nowadays, if you're telling me that stoking equivalent would be the knob, so maybe it's enough to just take the knob out. Maybe it's just enough to cover the knob. But that doesn't reduce the heat. So do you need to reduce the heat? Do you not need to reduce the heat? And that becomes part of the existential question of how we deal with this nowadays. Right, so this is a very involved Seif, as you see, and we haven't even started the Mishna Berura at all. But that is because this is a complex and completely loaded Seif in Shulchan Aruch.
Why don't we have the same concern over dimmers, for example?
Who says we don't?
I'd like to use dimmers. Sure.
You're talking about light dimmers or dimmer switch on cooking?
Light switches.
Oh, light switches, because again, we actually, I stick to the same answer. Who says we don't? Because we do have a concept of using lights when they could be tilted, right? So the Acharonim actually discuss whether a dimmer switch would be equivalent of, you can't learn in the light of a ner on Shabbat, the Mishnah says, because Shema Yateh, maybe you're going to tilt it to create more light. So that gives actually a room to a massive discussion in the Acharonim, in the current Acharonim, the last generation really started, whether or not a dimmer switch would be a problem as well. But that's not our topic right now. We'll get to that. Fine, so let's at least start. You're out of time. Yeah, let's leave this for. We will start the actual words of the Mishna Berura Be'ezrat Hashem the next year. Chazak Baruch.
Then why are we not worried about timers on Shabbat?
Say it again.
You know how the Siman that we did about timers and how you're allowed to put